Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just click the link in the show description to support now.
Welcome back to The Long Game. I'm John Ward. I've spent pretty much all my life fascinated by the interactions between religion and public life. I grew up in a very strict fundamentalist Christian church. I went to Christian music festivals, marched in anti-abortion protests with my parents, and watched my parents become loyal Republicans from the Reagan era on. As a journalist, I've been in rooms on the Upper East Side of Manhattan where secular liberals hissed and booed in 2004 at the mention of religious conservatives who they feared wanted to impose a theocracy, and I've interviewed Christians who believe America is a Christian nation and should be governed by the Bible. I've always believed myself that the church and state should not be joined together, but I've also been skeptical of those who say religious conviction should have no role in public life or politics. And I think many people feel this way. They're in the middle. I came across a book that is a few years old that does a compelling job of laying out this middle ground, American Covenant. It's by Philip Gorski, and he's a professor of sociology and religious studies at Yale University. The book, Gorski writes, is for those who know that the American project has a moral and spiritual core, but believe that the role of religion in public life is to be prophetic, holding those in power to account and holding them to higher principles, rather than seeking to hold power and domination for self-interest or self-preservation or self-promotion. Gorski argues that religious nationalism is just national self-worship, political idolatry, dressed up as religious orthodoxy. But he also says that radical secularism is little more than a misguided effort at cultural censorship, political illiberalism dressed up as liberal politics. Gorski says that one of the hidden weaknesses of secular progressivism today is its resistance to tradition. He aims in the book to provide historical narratives and exemplary figures from history to buttress and build up a living tradition that can sustain what he calls a vital center in American public life, a vital center who share a commitment to liberal democracy and a willingness to put national interests before political power when democracy itself is at risk, as it is now, he says. To be part of a tradition, he writes, is to know certain stories, read certain books, admire certain people, and care about certain things. And in this book, he not only lays out the ideas from American history, he lays out some of the key characters, people like Reinhold Niebuhr, Hannah Arendt, Martin Luther King, and others, many others, that can help us think not just in terms of abstract theory, but in terms of people who have lived and breathed these ideas. Gorski writes that the civil religious tradition is what should animate this vital center. We discuss what that term civil religious tradition means and how it is found in American history. But I thought I'd end this introduction by reading Gorski's comparison of civil religion to the two other options that he lays out, religious nationalism and radical secularism. Religious nationalism fails, he says, because it is idolatrous and thus irreligious. It fails because America was not founded as a Christian nation, and it fails because many modern-day Americans are not believing Christians, but are good citizens nonetheless. On the other hand, radical secularism fails because restricting religious expression violates liberal principles. Radical secularism fails because the United States was not founded on a total separation of religion and politics, and it fails because most Americans are still religious. The civil religious tradition, he says, is neither idolatrous nor illiberal because it recognizes both the sacred and secular sources of the American creed. The civil religious tradition provides a political vision that can be embraced by believers and non-believers alike, and it is capacious enough to incorporate new generations of Americans. As Gorski and I get into near the end of this podcast, I think there's a pretty strong connection between this book and Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, which I just talked about on a previous podcast episode. Rauch's book makes the argument for how we should agree on what is true and what is not. It's on the system for manufacturing knowledge and how we should do that. This book really provides a historical, theological, philosophical, and moral argument and a set of characters and stories, that living tradition, for why that Constitution of Knowledge is the best hope for American democracy and how it is truly American as well. In the process, it calls out as false many of the ideas and stories being promoted by right-wing figures today, such as Tucker Carlson. And it illuminates how the right-wing populism promoted by Carlson and others is not actually faithful to the vision of this country cast by the founders or our founding ideals. Here's my conversation with Professor Philip Gorski. The book is American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from the Puritans to the Present. I will say this, I spoke to, a lot of people about this book as I was reading it, and they all, kind of looked at it and looked at the title and thought, oh, that sounds heavy. And it is heavy. It's a lot of content or whatever, but you write it in an accessible way, I think, very much. I just think it's a compelling read. So thank you for writing it. I wanted to start with a basic question, which is going to kind of maybe skip to the end and then we'll back up. But you argue increasingly over the book that Americans have lost sight of what freedom is. And I just wondered if you could explain how and why you think that's the case.
Well, so I think if you were to ask most folks, just passing them on the street, say, define freedom for me, they'd say something like doing what I want, not being interfered with by other people, and I think that is kind of a commonsensical view of freedom for many Americans. But the thing is that's not really the kind of traditional or historic way that freedom was understood by most Americans, and certainly not the way that the term freedom was understood by the American founders or by many of the early colonists, right? I mean, they had a very different understanding of freedom, and I think the best way to summarize it is to say that for them, freedom meant self-government. And so when you hear that phrase self-government, you immediately think of, they mean like democracy, like elections and, people serving in office. And that's part of it. But I mean, the other piece of it for them was they meant that you had to govern yourself. And in particular, what they meant is, that you shouldn't just be driven by your desires and your passions, right? That, you had to be kind of deliberate and thoughtful and rational insofar as possible. And I think especially that last part has gotten lost for a lot of folks. I think again that, what they meant by passion was really being governed by your emotions, and your desires. And that's the exact opposite of what a lot of Americans thinkers in the past have understood by freedom. And I think that we do need to recapture that. And I think we also just need to think about freedom too, as in the sense of self-government, which is, voting in elections is definitely a part of that. But I think what they had in mind was something that goes beyond that. I mean, being an informed citizen, engaging with other citizens, if you are called to serve in some way, politically or socially that you're ready to take that call up. So that's a much kind of thicker understanding of freedom, I think, than many folks do today.
Yeah, I mean, there are three elements to freedom that you kind of hit on repeatedly throughout the book, and tell me if these are the correct labels. But at one point, you use the label non-independence, or is that actually the opposite of it? I guess independence would be the ingredient, and non-independence would be the opposite, and that just means you're not being ruled by someone else. But then it's self-mastery and active citizenship. Am I getting the three sort of elements of freedom correct there?
That's exactly right. And so this idea of non-dependence is really important,
right,
too. Because I think people do capture that in the sense they think, well, it's not good to be dependent on government. But I think that the founders understood this in a broader way to mean that, you shouldn't be dependent, for example, economically completely on your employer. For them, of course, this was a lot easier to realize, if you were, in a sort of more agricultural society, unlike the one that we live in. And so, figuring out what non-dependence means today is I think a somewhat trickier enterprise than it would have been for them.
Yeah, so you place the book in between Christian nationalism or religious nationalism broadly. Christian nationalism is how that plays out in America, but you place the book in between that and radical secularism. The book is essentially an argument for those who don't want church and state too close together, and they don't want church and state too far apart. You write that these are people who know that the American project has a moral and a spiritual core, and the book is an effort to give voice to the historical tradition that undergirds those people's deepest convictions in a time when the best are denounced for lacking all conviction. One of the things I really like about this book is that you are pretty adamant that, democratic self-government or the civic republicanism that you are arguing for really need more than theory and abstract values. It needs historical narratives and exemplary figures. And the book, is basically constructed around those two things, historical narrative and exemplary figures. But before we get to all that, I just referenced that term, civic republicanism. That is essentially what you're arguing for. How do you define that term?
Yeah, so I think people tend to think, well, America was founded as a liberal democracy or as a secular democracy. And for sure, kind of liberalism in the philosophical sense had a big influence. I'm thinking about somebody like John Locke, right, who, his two treatises on self-government were read by, a lot of the founders and revolutionaries and was influential. But if you read a lot of their work, they're looking even further back. I mean, they're looking to Rome and Greece, or they're looking to kind of republican, free republican city states like, Florence or the Netherlands, places like this, and in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So they really see, American democracy as part of this really long tradition of civic republicanism. And so you might be asking, well, all right, so how is that really different from, what we think of as representative self-government? And I think there are some important differences. And one of the most important ones is this idea that keeping self-government requires a virtuous citizenry. Right. It doesn't just require separation of powers. It doesn't just require, a written constitution. I mean, those things are important, but it also requires a virtuous citizenry. And they understood virtue like in a fairly expansive way, like people who are courageous, people who are generous, people, who are sort of broad-minded, right? They didn't just mean it in a kind of narrow way, like we sometimes think about it like, oh, being virtuous is being kind of prudish or something like that. I mean, they understood it in a sort of in a different way. But I do think that that message has really been vindicated. Over recent years, I think a lot of folks look at, sort of politicians who represent many of us in Washington, and I think, wow, these are people whose main concern is just getting reelected or, collecting campaign checks, contributions. And, I think it's become very clear that unless there are people who are willing to kind of be courageous and honest and generous in important moments, that, a Constitution is just a piece of paper without that. Mm-hmm. So that, I think, is really the central point for us. And the thing that they really did worry about most was corruption. And again, like corruption, when we hear that word corruption, we think, well, that's like kind of pay to play or quid pro quo. Like, to be corrupt is, somebody hands you a bunch of Andrew Jacksons in a paper bag. I mean, that's not. They had a much broader understanding of that, and what they really just meant is, when you are not acting with the public good and the common good, first and foremost in your mind, that's what corruption means. And they saw it really as a kind of a disease, that can kind of spread and really weaken and eventually rot out the core of government. So those are the two things I'd really point to. Like, virtue is important and corruption is worrisome.
So, yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, this book is trying to explain how a concern for the common good and a concern for a freedom that incorporates concern for the common good became corrupted. Am I correct in that sort of general thrust?
Yes.
How it all became individualistic over, the course of American history. And what you're attempting to do in this book is, and I want to ask you about, Tucker Carlson's trip to Hungary here. That's the sort of most topical point of connection to these themes at the moment that we're living in. But I think, maybe we just skip there and I'll come back to some of these other questions since I brought it up. I think what you're trying to do is not just present a framework of arguments against the nationalism that Tucker Carlson is representing and arguing for and promoting. You're also trying to present an argument that what he presents as American, as based on the core values of what it means to be American, are actually not loyal to the ideas, the commitments, the principles, the values that were held by the founders of our country and by the influences on them. Is that sort of, there's a tradition here that you're saying exists that we've gotten away from that actually is what makes America unique. Is that kind of the general thrust?
For sure, yeah. I think even to sort of broaden this out a little bit beyond, Tucker Carlson, because I think it's part of a broader debate that we're having right now in America, and that is about, what is our story and who are our heroes, and whom should we look to for inspiration, and how does that help us to sort of chart out the future. And there's one set of folks who say, well, America is a white Christian nation. Sometimes they say that quite explicitly, and sometimes they don't say it quite so explicitly. Somebody like Tucker Carlson, who when he talks about we or us or real Americans or real police people, real police officers, you kind of always know what he means. It's a little bit with a wink and a nod, and that's why folks like him admire, Hungary, and for that matter, Russia, because they see them as these countries that are dominated by a kind of a white Christian nationalist leadership that's, kind of very authoritarian and very kind of anti-pluralistic. I don't think that's, I don't think that really captures the American tradition or the American spirit. We've always been a very diverse country. I think it's pretty hard to really say that the country was just founded by white Christians. I mean, as we all know, it was largely built through slave labor, and a lot of the land that we live on, originally belonged to Native Americans. So it's kind of hard to really make that case that the country was just built by white Christian men. They are part of the story. Can't be written out of the story, but they're not the whole story. And so what we need is a story that really is broader, that includes all of the folks who have contributed to building up America. So that's, I think, is what we're really in the middle of, and you can really see this, I think, especially clearly in the battle around, kind of Confederate history and Confederate monuments right now, right? It's like, should Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee be our heroes?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Should, we think of, the Civil War as a kind of a lost cause and a war of Northern aggression. And, it's all fairly familiar to a lot of folks, I'm sure, or should we see that as a wrong turn,
Mm-hmm.
And I, for one, am definitely somebody who sees that as a wrong turn.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you mention Confederate monuments, I think of critical race theory and the controversy and debate over that. And I think there may be a connection here between the ways that, when there are calls for America to really reckon with its history on race, on systemic racism, people who want to resist that then go and find examples of which there are, some and some prominent ones of overreach and ideas that go too far in trying to talk about systemic racism or white guilt. All of that obviously is a discussion worth having, but a lot of those labels about critical race theory are used to try to kind of shut that conversation down. Is it the case that concerns about sexual permissiveness are used in a similar way when you're talking about how is that issue used? Is it used to try to distract from the call under what you're talking about in this book is the long-standing call of prophetic what's the term that you use? Prophetic
republicanism or prophetic religion. Yeah.
It's really prophetic religion going back to the Hebrew prophets who called on, a country under covenant. Your book's called American Covenant, to look out for the least of these and to avoid greed and avoid materialism. Do you feel like the obsession with sexuality, not to dismiss it as a valid issue of discussion and concern, but is it used as a distraction in the way that critical race theory is used on race? Is that what's going on there in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely right. I think just to kind of start with the critical race theory thing, as a lot of people have pointed out, if somebody says, well, I think your child might be learning critical race theory, and it's like, well, congratulations. I guess they must be studying at a very elite law school right now, because, that's pretty much the only place you'd really learn critical race theory. And I think what people often mean by that is just like any talk about race at all, and that the role that it's played in our history, and the way that it continues to affect our society. That I think is really the point, that there's a lot of racial inequities and injustices in our society, which aren't the result of things that people who are alive today necessarily did. It's not the result, not because all white Americans are walking around with horrible racial prejudices in their minds, but it's the result of past policies and decisions. 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, that still have consequences. And just often the kind of attack on critical race theory is just a way of saying, I don't want to talk about that. I don't feel any responsibility for that. I don't think we should do anything about that. And I think that is, like you said, is, if you are somebody, if you're Christian or if you're Jewish, or, even if you're a secular person who resonates to that those kind of values of kind of social justice and social inclusion, you've got to take that stuff seriously. And I do think that, the sexuality and family stuff is very complicated for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see, I think, well-meaning people can wind up on different sides of some of those conversations. But, I would just point out, Jesus himself, told people to back off from stoning an adulteress. Some of the, the women who were part of his inner circle were, possibly prostitutes or former prostitutes. He was not so quick to judge and throw stones. And I think, we need to really remember that when we, engage in those debates and be very open-minded about these sorts of questions.
Yeah, what I think is interesting, I'll just note that, there's a great section in the book about Reinhold Niebuhr and the way that he critiqued religious nationalism. That's a great section. I really enjoyed that. But I want to focus instead on a section where you talk about how Jerry Falwell and Ronald Reagan were a big part of reworking. I think your argument is that they reworked civil religion into nationalism, but you kind of talk about the ways in which the focus on the nuclear family and on sexuality became the predominant concern. What was that transition? What was the switch that happened there in terms of a set of values to a different set of values or concerns?
Yeah, so I think if you look back in the kind of religious traditions that somebody like Jerry Falwell himself was a part of, which is, kind of a Baptist tradition, a sort of holiness tradition, the way that folks understood, morality was, Christian morality was pretty broad gauged, and it, included a lot of things, but it wasn't sort of focused laser beam like just on your sexual behavior. And I think that sort of narrowing down and focusing on sexual behavior was a way of, pushing a bunch of other stuff that had traditionally been very central to Christian ethics, kind of to the side. And I think it was also a way of, just kind of pointing fingers at other people instead of taking accountability yourself, because you could sort of say, well, the problem with American society today, it's, the adulteresses and it's the abortionists and, it's the homosexuals, right? Kind of the culture wars lines from when I was young in the 80s. And, I think somebody like Niebuhr does, he says, look, the original sin is pride and self-love. That's really what the Garden of Eden story tells us about. And so, we have to, be, just sort of very vigilant, understanding the way in which, our love of ourselves and our pride about ourselves makes it harder for us to see ourselves accurately and to open ourselves up fully to other people and to really kind of seek justice and community with other people. And I think that was really one of his central messages. And, that discussion of his of religious nationalism, I mean, was really moving for me too. And I think that's part of the reason why, that sort of comes through that way in the book, because it really helped me to see, something that was very important that I hadn't understood, which is the way he defines religious nationalism is it is a way of for folks who are just regular folks to sort of attach themselves to something that feels larger than them and sort of have that be the thing that they take pride in and derive their meaning from. And for him, this is a problem in two ways. I mean, first is that, like, if you're a Christian, that thing that's bigger than you that you should be attaching yourself to is not your country, it's right. God, right? And that sort of feeling of smallness that leads you to attach yourself to the nation is something that you just have to accept. I mean, it's just, we are, from a Christian perspective, finite, created beings who are in certain ways kind of imperfect or even broken. And part of the Christian faith is accepting that as part of what it means to be human. And so, from his perspective, religious nationalism is really a big problem because it's taking pride in the wrong thing, and it's not facing up to your own limitations.
I'm going to actually read a section that I enjoyed the most from that. One of the most dangerous forms of collective pride, said Niebuhr, is modern religious nationalisms. What makes them so dangerous is that they conjoin so many different forms of collective pride, not only spiritual and national pride, but race and class pride as well, and then arm them with the power of the modern state. Nation is easily combined with religion because of their shared aura of the sacred. The masses are easily mobilized because the man in the street with his lust for power and prestige, thwarted by his own limitations and the necessities of social life, projects his ego upon the nation and indulges his anarchic lusts vicariously. Writing in the closing years of World War II, Niebuhr argued that religious nationalisms are not merely idolatrous but truly demonic, not only in the theological sense that they involve the invasion and possession of the self, but by a racial and national spirit, but also in the material sense that they can unleash apocalyptic forms of death and destruction. America, Niebuhr contended, has still not exorcised this demon nor escaped these apocalyptic dangers. You wrote that in 2017, and it's obviously much more true today, after what we've seen with the rise of Trump and with January 6th and the ongoing devotion to the lie that the election was stolen. Did you want to add anything to that, or should I move on?
It's pretty hard to top Niebuhr on that. I mean, he was just an amazingly insightful, not just an insightful theologian, but for me, kind of an insightful social thinker too. Just really, really, really profound thinker. So yeah, I don't think I can really top what he said. Just except to say that that analysis, in our current moment feels more relevant than ever. I mean, the way that he describes modern religious nationalisms really gives you kind of a framework for understanding, the resurgence of white Christian nationalism in the United States, and for that matter, the outbreak of violence on January 6th. Really, really insightful analysis. It's still relevant 60 years later.
So just to get back to the thread we were pulling on, Falwell and Reagan were part of this reworking. And I just want to make sure that I'm clear about this, because my understanding of what you were arguing is that, at some point things shifted for conservatives, but it doesn't seem that it was just Reagan and Falwell who did this, right? This reworking of a focus on sexuality. Or was that the moment when that really crystallized?
Yeah, so I guess this is one thing which one area where if I were rewriting the book today, having spent another 6-7 years kind of reading and thinking about this, where I probably would put things a little bit differently. So I guess the first thing that's become really clear to me is that kind of the resurgence of, or formation, I guess I should say, of what people sometimes call the religious right. The usual narrative we hear about that is, that's, about Roe v. Wade and the sexual revolution in the 1960s. And I think that's actually secondary. I think if you really look more carefully, you see the beginnings of this. It's the civil rights struggle and desegregation, which really sets it off. And somebody like Falwell is a great example of this. So, here's a guy who was pretty apolitical, when he was younger, and even in some ways, a little bit progressive on some kind of, some sorts of social issues, by which I mean, things like, unemployment insurance or social security, things like that. And what really politicized him was not the sexual revolution, it was civil rights. He was, like a lot of folks of his generation, definitely a diehard segregationist, believed that segregation was, kind of a Christian thing. And so they really started, sort of moving towards the Republican Party during that period. And so the sexual revolution plays a role, but the role is more, it's not so much in mobilizing a certain kind of conservative white Protestant. It's in forging a coalition between those conservative white Protestants and some conservative white Catholics. Abortion had always been a Catholic issue. It was a Catholic issue, 100 years ago. It was a Catholic issue 60 years ago, and abortion didn't really become an evangelical issue until the late 70s as part of the formation of this alliance. I don't want to, sort of play, abortion down and say, oh, that's something nobody should care about. And, anybody who's pro-life is an idiot. I mean, I think it's an extremely difficult moral issue.
No, but what you're saying is that it was, what you're getting at is what was the genesis of the political coalition that was created.
Right.
What was the motivation? What was the fuel for it?
Right.
The other thing, my parents became born again believers in the 70s as part of the Jesus movement. And I've reflected on like what happened to that movement, which was fairly radical in its call for people to, sacrifice themselves for others and to look out for the poor. The other thing I think that abortion was used to do was to fuse together people like my parents who were Northeastern, raised Catholic, raised Episcopalian. As far as I mean, there was probably some racism in their family background, but not a ton. And so I think they were just very well-meaning evangelical Christians who were born again Jesus people in the 70s, and they were kind of fused together with the Falwell bloc politically against abortion. Is that something that you've seen also in your studies?
Absolutely. That's another part of the story, for sure. Right. And one that probably doesn't get as much attention as kind of the Catholic part of the story. But I can tell stories like that in my own family. Cousins that I have who went through that exact same evolution that you're describing, from, the kind of, hippies for Jesus, if I can put it that way, to, just very conservative, Republicans, 20, 30 years later. And abortion was really crucial to that happening. So I think you're just dead on about that.
Do you remember the singer Keith Green? He was this he was a prophet. He was this guy who would just rail against his own Christian audiences for their selfishness, their materialism. And he, did a lot of work himself to try to bring people off the streets. He died in 82, and by the mid 80s, his widow, Melody, I believe her name is, had become a prominent anti-abortion activist, and that had become her main issue. I think right there you kind of see what happened in about 10 years that brought these people who were part of a prophetic tradition that was not captive to either party firmly into the hands of the Republican Party right there.
Exactly.
So I also wanted to ask you about the confessional state real quick. I had never heard of John Courtney Murray, but he has a critique of the confessional state, which was, we'll just explain what the confessional state is real quickly. I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah. So, and this turned out is also relevant, and we can maybe circle back to, folks like Tucker Carlson at the end of this. But, there was always a somewhat uneasy relationship between Catholicism and democracy until 60 or 70 years ago. We're in many countries in Europe, think about Spain, for example, or think about Italy that, were just almost 100% Catholic, where there had always been, pretty tight relationship between church and state, and where, in the case of a place like, Franco's Spain, you basically had this sort of hand in glove alliance between the Catholic Church and a kind of authoritarian regime. And you find versions of this in Latin America as well. And so there was, this wasn't just like an accident. I mean, there was kind of a whole theological doctrine that some conservative Catholic theologians adhered to, and kind of crystallized in this phrase of the the confessional state, which is the idea that if you think the thing that's most important is divine salvation, and you think that people can have divine salvation if you just kind of make them say certain things or participate in certain rituals, you're kind of doing it for their own good. Well, then maybe it's okay to use the kind of power of the state to force people to be Christians in their own self-interest. And I mean, you can see right away that this is just completely contradictory with the American tradition of religious freedom, which just says, look, you can't be a true Christian without, true personal inner conviction, and there's no sense in trying to force anybody to be a Christian. It's counterproductive. So John Courtney Murray is a really important figure because he's a Catholic theologian, from the 1960s, who really critiques this from the inside. I mean, he's not like necessarily somebody who you think of today as like progressive in a lot of regards, but on this issue of religious freedom, he's really adamant. And why is this relevant today? Well, you might at first think, well, geez, I mean, aren't Christian conservatives talking a lot about religious freedom and the threat to religious freedom? And that's true, and I think that's often sincere, though sometimes it's just a way of, refusing to engage with the rights of gay people or people who are really different than they are, and realize they got to kind of compromise in some ways. But it's also relevant because there are more and more folks leading kind of intellectuals and pundits on the religious right, Catholics, but not only Catholics, who are embracing in this idea of a confessional state and would like America to become something like a confessional state. So just, one example, I'll give you two examples. One is Josh Mandel, this kind of super Trumpy Republican candidate for Senate in Ohio, just the other day tweeted out, "We need a Christian revolution." Well, what does he exactly mean by a Christian revolution? Well, I think you can figure out what he means. Like we're going to impose Christianity on everybody else. Or, like a kind of a more intellectual version of this is Adrian Vermeulen, who's a professor at the Harvard Law School. And he's written these very kind of highbrow, very learned articles. He's a very smart man. About Catholic integralism, which is basically just another term for this idea of a confessional state, that you want a union between church and state to impose, right morality and right doctrine on everybody else. And that's what Tucker Carlson is doing over in Hungary. And that's why folks like Rod Dreher and Patrick Deneen are, kind of very Hungary curious these days, because they look at places like Hungary and even more at a place like Russia and think, here you've got a kind of strongman leader who's, putting the non-Christians in their place and taking a stand against the Muslims and the immigrants, and kind of create a Christian democracy in a very particular sense. And that to me that's a really worrisome development. I mean, that is a real turn away from the longstanding tradition in the United States of Christianity and democracy going together, and not in that way.
Christianity and democracy going together, you said?
Going together, right?
Yeah.
Like if you look at, like Alexis de Tocqueville in his book, Democracy in America, he says, one of the reasons democracy works in America and not in France is because of there's a kind of Christianity there which is rooted in ideals of kind of individual conscience and religious freedom and separation of church and state, right? That's why Christianity and democracy go together. Christianity teaches people to be good citizens, teaches people to care about social justice, teaches people to be engaged citizens. But it realizes that the church and the state are not the same thing. And what you're seeing now is people who are rejecting that view and are increasingly, if they feel like, well, I've got to choose between Christianity and democracy, I'm going to embrace my version of Christianity and see if I can impose that on everybody else.
Right. So what of your Vermeulen and Tucker Carlson and Dreher and Deneen? What are they getting wrong?
Well, I mean, I think theologically, they're getting a lot of things wrong. I think kind of politically, they're getting a lot of things wrong. But let me just say, one thing is, I think they don't even understand what's in their own best self-interest. Because one of the reasons why Christianity and democracy have gone together in the U.S. is because it's been good for both Christianity and democracy. Yeah. The kind of religious freedom that we have in the United States has been good for Christianity, and the kind of authoritarian rule that you see in many other places, where you've got this union between church and state and the government is shoving religion down people's throats. Well, what happens? I mean, it makes people think, well, geez, I don't agree with those politics. And if that politics means that kind of religion, I don't want that kind of religion either. I'm not having any of that. And that's a lot of the reason why places like France and Spain and Italy have become so incredibly secular. Why Christianity has declined so rapidly there. It's because people just don't want that whole package of conservative religion plus conservative politics. You can already see this happening in the United States. Sure. What's the fastest growing group in the American religious landscape? Is it evangelicals? Nope. Is it Pentecostals? Nope. Is it Catholics? Nope. No, it's the so-called nuns. Right. The people who say, or if you ask them, what's your religious affiliation? They'll be like, none. I don't want to have anything to do with that. There are many nuns now as there are evangelicals, just to put this in perspective. And that's something that's happened over the last 20 years, and it's closely connected to this incredibly tight embrace between conservative politics and religion that's emerged during that time.
And this book we're discussing, is basically saying to those nuns, you may not like the right-wing politics, you might not like fundamentalist or apocalyptic evangelical or Pentecostalism, but America does have a moral and religious, it does have roots in those things, it does have traditions in those things, and the Christian religion does have a lot to offer to the American idea. And
Absolutely.
To what made America great. And so what is the Christian argument for pluralism?
So I think this is a great question. It's a really, really, really important question. Here I'm going to channel somebody who I've also come to respect more and more, and that's Roger Williams. So Roger Williams was a kind of a Puritan dissenter in the 17th century. He kind of runs afoul of the authorities in Boston and Massachusetts, and they exile him, and he goes north and founds Rhode Island, and is often seen as kind of one of the founders of the kind of Baptist tradition within the United States. And so just a couple of things that he really strongly believed that I think are really important to sort of understanding how Christianity and democracy can go together. So one is, he says, religion and morality are not the same thing. There are lots of people who aren't religious, who aren't of the same religion as you, who are nonetheless moral. And why is that important? It means that, you can work together with folks who are not Christian, to build a good society. Just because somebody's not the same religion as you doesn't mean they're evil and that you can't engage with them. And, for him, those others were the Native Americans, who he thought were, he learned Native American languages, he traded and spent time with Native Americans. He came to the view that in many ways, a lot of the Native Americans we got to know he found them to be, sort of more upright morally than a lot of the folks back in, Puritan Massachusetts at the time, right? So
Sounds kind of familiar.
yeah, exactly, exactly. He was also, really strongly believed in separation of church and state. And this is important. Again, he didn't believe in separation of church and state because he didn't think religious people shouldn't. He didn't believe in this because he thought religious people shouldn't be involved in politics. He believed this because he thought that, governmental power can only corrupt religious institutions, and the closer, the minute, those two things, government and party politics, shapes religion too much, it's gonna corrupt it. So that's a really important thing. And the third thing, and this is really relevant for today, for our conversations, is he was a really strong advocate of what he called civility. And by civility, he didn't mean politeness exactly. I mean, nobody would have called Roger Williams polite. He was a very opinionated man, a very argumentative man. He had very strong views about things. But what he meant by this is he meant, look, we have differences. We're going to talk about those differences, and we're going to say what we really believe, and I'm going to try to persuade you. If I don't persuade you, we're still going to find ways to live together and get along based on the sort of common good things that we can agree on. So, for him, civility wasn't being polite. It meant being tolerant of difference of views and engaging with people whose views are different than yours. And I think, for him, all those things came directly out of his Christian beliefs, right? Those were not things that were political beliefs. So it had to do with his view of the church. It had to do with his view of individual conscience, and it had to do, with his views about morality. So that's a way. That's the kind of a Christian argument for, why we have to accept pluralism and how we can live together in a pluralistic society.
Well, I don't know if you've read this book, but actually 2 episodes ago, my interview was with Jonathan Rauch, who wrote a book called The Constitution of Knowledge. Have you heard of this book?
I've read things that he's written online, but I haven't read the book yet. I'm sorry to say, but I've heard great things about it.
Yeah, and he writes the book about how the Constitution of Knowledge was a system for producing consensus around public knowledge, not necessarily religious or private belief, but around public knowledge that could help societies avoid the bloodshed of the religious wars in Europe, during the 15 and 1600s and prior to that. And, it does seem that Christianity has been a key ingredient in American democracy to preserve a space for the manufacturing of this Constitution of Knowledge, which in Rauch's words allows us to kill each other's ideas rather than each other. Mm-hmm. And so I think, when you get into these ideas that Vermeule is talking about, it's all about coercion and force rather than appeals to reason and engagement. And it just doesn't seem like that's going to end in a good way, historically speaking. You're a historian, so I think you would know. Yeah, no, the experiments that have been run on that have not turned out very, very well. And I think a lot of the success of the United States has been, the willingness of people to, just keep on debating and disagreeing and trying to work out their disagreements through debate. Yeah. Well, I want to end on one topic, but before I mention that, I just wanted to say I really love the language, which is based in deep study of history and ideas, but the language of prophetic, and you use the word repent in a couple places. I don't think that any language will get the attention of religious conservatives in America regarding the last few years if words like repentance are not actually used. And so that requires some thought about why repentance is needed. And I think your book is a really helpful guide to that, really helpful for that. I just wanted to end by talking about this idea of public happiness, which I found so fascinating. Hannah Arendt talks about it. John Courtney Murray talks about it. Excuse me. I mean, this is the idea that when we talk about the pursuit of happiness, we're not talking about private and personal pleasure. We're not talking about consumption. We're not talking about material success. We're talking about sort of one of those elements of freedom, which is active citizenship. What does that term public happiness mean?
So let me just start out by saying I think it's one example of a broader kind of phenomenon, right? That many of us will have experienced in areas of our lives outside of politics. So I think most people have had experiences where they've been part of a team, or they've been part of a group or a committee, or some kind of collective enterprise, where sort of a group has folks have gotten together and they've had a common goal, and they've worked together to achieve that goal and figure out the best way to achieve that goal. And that is a source of a kind of a deep and lasting satisfaction and happiness, right? Which is very different from what you get from buying some stuff, with the package arrives from Amazon with a little smiley face on it, and you kind of get excited for a couple of minutes, and you rip it open and tear through the packaging and look at the shiny object. But that kind of happiness is pretty fleeting, as I think we all know. It's addictive, but it's very fleeting. Whereas when you engage in some kind of collective endeavor with some other people and accomplish something, that's something that brings you sort of lasting happiness that you remember when you get together with those folks again, that you recall, later on. And so public happiness, the way that like Arendt and some of the American founders described it, it's like an example of that in our collective political life, right? Which is that there's a certain kind of satisfaction that you can get from being engaged in your local community or in your national community, the political life of your country. That's just much greater than this sort of fleeting sort of happiness that you experience in a lot of other areas of your life. And it is, one of the rewards of active citizenship. I think people often tend to think about, being a citizen as kind of burdensome, but if you talk to people who have, like community leaders or movement leaders or kind of activist folks, those people are not unhappy. Those people don't feel like, they sacrifice something for nothing in return. I'm not saying that kind of work isn't frustrating sometimes and
right,
aggravating sometimes, but, those in my experience are some of the happiest people that you'll ever meet.
Fulfilled. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot more we could say about that topic. I think it feeds into this idea that, the call of the Christian is to do more than just sort of say, hey, politically is to do more than just say, hey, government, get out of my rights. The call, the mandate of the Christian is actually to work for the common good. I guess I actually wanted to circle back to this idea of repentance, and let's end here. You do mention in the introduction that which you wrote as a new introduction or a new preface. Let me just quote it. And this is actually what I was asking you about on Twitter. You say Trumpism is a form of religious nationalism, and that is, and we can only hope that white evangelicals, will one day repent this heresy. There's two challenges to this statement. One is that the intended audience that you hope repents, American white evangelicals, is kind of tuned out to any such calls because of their sort of tribal stance. Any mention of Trump sort of, which is critical, kind of activates this automatic response of, well, I'm not going to listen to that. The other problem is that a lot of people who you might want to employ that argument would be uncomfortable with that language.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, why do you believe that white American evangelicals should repent of Trumpism?
Because I do think that it is a form of heresy and idolatry. It's a kind of a cult built around the worship of of a very human man, an old person who's only human, and because it also implies accepting a lot of things that we just shouldn't accept and ignoring a lot of things we shouldn't ignore. It means, accepting, a certain kind of tribalism and racism, which just to me is just completely at odds with the kind of universalism of of Christian ethics, and it also involves just ignoring the way in which Christians, not only Christians but also Christians in the past in the United States, have been complicit in many sins. I mean, the sin of chattel slavery, is a very important one. I will say, I realize there are a lot of folks out there who just, as you say, the minute you make this argument, they just, completely shut down and don't want to talk about it. But, I think there is, especially there are in some circles, there is real serious reflection and engagement going on around these issues. I'm originally from Wheaton, Illinois, which, as you probably know, is the home of Wheaton College, which has long been one of the most important evangelical institutions of higher learning in the United States. And there's a lot of very serious discussion going on there. They're one of their leading New Testament scholars is Esau McCauley, who's a very prominent African-American New Testament scholar who also just a beautiful writer. He's written very movingly about these things. They actually even have a bona fide critical race theorist in their philosophy department, whom I follow on Twitter as well. And, earlier this year, they issued a bunch of the faculty issued a statement sort of distancing themselves from both Christian nationalism and white supremacism. That's not something that would have happened there 40 years ago. So, I do think there's a bit of the parting of the ways going on around these issues, but there are definitely some folks who are choosing the path of repentance and are willing to kind of look critically in the mirror and look critically at the history of their own faith tradition, which I think is what has to happen if we're going to ever move past this moment.
Yeah, and despite the fact that I said, I think what I was saying about people tuning out is that when I ask you that question, why should Christians repent of Trumpism? I guess just framed that way or put in such a, small box of a few minutes. Most people watching on their phone or whatever, or listening on their phone, they're just going to tune that out. But I do think as a rhetorical device, as an argument, as a grounded argument between people who have a relationship, I do think that it has some power to persuade. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is, it's difficult, it's difficult for all of us to really look at ourselves in an honest way and, admit the faults of ourselves and our communities, and it's easier to sort of come to terms with that when you do it together with somebody who you feel is, you have a close relationship with and is part of that community that you're a part of. So I do think that, the talk of repentance is going to be much more powerful if it comes from within than from without.
Yeah. Well, we don't have time to go over your other two books, but you have published one, American Babylon. Is that what it's called? And,
American Babylon, yeah.
And the one that's coming out in 2022 is I wrote it down, I think.
The Flag and the Cross: White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy. So, and there we talk a lot more about the way in which kind of Christian nationalism has always been bound up with race in the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned that that's something that's become more prominent in your thinking, so that explains why. Eddie Glaude's book on James Baldwin makes these arguments that you made about the transition in the 60s and 70s. I haven't read Anthea Butler's new book, but I believe it makes some of the same arguments. Have you read that
one?
One?
I have, and it does. You're right. You're exactly right. So I think there really is a sort of a sea change going on right now in the kind of scholarly discussion about this with, scholars of religion and theologians and historians, and I think there are a lot of theologians who are, really grappling with this more. I, would point to Willie Jennings' work, which is on this as well. So lots of great stuff out there.
What book from Willie Jennings I have Christian Imagination. Is that the one you would recommend, or is that
yes, that's the one I would recommend. And what's powerful about that book is, the other books are kind of more history, whereas Willie is really doing scriptural exegesis and showing the way in which the way that many American Christians have read the Bible just kind of reads race into the Bible in ways that just aren't there.
So much work to do, so much reading, and so much work to do. Well, thank you, Professor, very much for speaking with me about your book. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you to Professor Gorski for speaking with me. If you like this show, please give it a 5-star rating and a review, and please subscribe. The intro and outro music is by Dan Koch, host of the You Have Permission podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm John Ward. Until next time, this is The Long Game.